Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I want to take you to Union occupied Nashville, Tennessee, where in January 1864, Major General Ulysses S. Grant assigned newly minted Brigadier General Augustus Louis Chetlain, life dates 1824 to 1914, to recruit and organize colored troops for the United States Army. Grant believed Chetlain well suited to the task. The two men had known each other back in Galena, Illinois before the war. Chetlain, in fact, was Grant's first recruit for a Galena company that became part of the 12th Illinois Infantry. Chetlain was elected as captain of the company by the rank and file and went on to distinguish himself in 1862 at the Battle of Fort Donelson while serving under Grant, who became famous with his utterance unconditional surrender as part of the proceedings that ended in the capitulation of Confederate forces to Grant. Now, flash forward 2 years later, January 1864, Grant has a new assignment for Chetlain. He wants Chetlain to raise regiments of black men in blue in Tennessee and Kentucky. Chetlain described what happened next in his 1899 memoir called Recollections of 70 Years. I want to read to you some relevant passages so you get a sense of Chetlain's recruiting process, his success, early success in Tennessee. We're looking a year after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, about 6 months after the 54th Massachusetts Infantry distinguished themselves at Fort Wagner, and months into the new development of U.S. colored troops across the southern states and the northern states. You're going to hear about those successes. You're going to hear about some challenges in Kentucky from unhappy citizens and other details. So without delay, let me get into the passages from Chetlain from his book. So here we go. He writes, "Soon after my promotion to Brigadier General, I reported to General Grant at Nashville in early January 1864 for assignment to duty. He, Grant, congratulated me on my well-deserved promotion and said he had decided to assign me to a position which, without being arduous, would require close attention to details. It was to superintend the recruiting and organizing of colored troops in Tennessee and West Kentucky, a work already begun and which needed an energetic and discriminating officer at its head. He, Grant, said that if I had any objection to doing the work, he would assign me to some other duty. I replied that if he believed I was fitted to do it, to command me." What a great response from a subordinate. He then said that it was the policy of the government, which he fully endorsed, to place a large force of colored troops in the service at once, that the experiment of using the colored men of the South in the Army so far had proved satisfactory. After a pause, he added, "I believe the colored man will make a good soldier. He has been accustomed all his life to lean on the white man, and if a good officer is placed over him, he will learn readily and make an efficient soldier." My headquarters, Chetlain continued, were to be at Memphis. Soon after I had begun my work at Memphis, I received a call from my friend, General Sherman. It's William T. Sherman. After he had greeted me, he said in his usual earnest manner, "Well, Chetlain, you have undertaken the work of making soldiers of colored men. You have a big job on your hands. The colored man will make a fairly good soldier, but it will take time. Don't be too sanguine. If you make an efficient soldier of him in a year or a year and a half, you will be doing well. I wish you success." Comparing Grant's and Sherman's opinion of the colored man's adaptability to make him a soldier, Grant was right rather than Sherman, as was subsequently proven. Near the close of the month of June 1864, my work in recruiting and organizing colored troops had proved so decidedly successful that it was deemed best at Washington to extend my field of operation over central and east Kentucky. I received an order to that effect and moved my headquarters to Louisville. The state of Kentucky, not having seceded, retained its place in the Union and its representatives their seats in Congress. After the Confederate Army had invaded the state, martial law was declared. The policy of placing colored troops in the Army was combated by the Kentuckians. They favored voluntary but not forced enlistments. Our method of recruiting was simple. A company of colored troops, fully equipped, would be sent to a certain section of the state with orders to bring in all colored men found of suitable age and of apparent good health and physique. After an examination by an army surgeon, all the rejected were sent back to their homes. The owners of those accepted as fit for service had a receipt given to them with the proviso inserted that all owners would, when the time came, be paid by the government $300 for each slave, provided they prove their loyalty to it. Recruiting stations were then established at Louisville, Owensboro, and other points in the state. By the 4th of July, we had at Louisville one full regiment, armed, uniformed, and fairly well drilled, and 2 regiments more than half filled, all officered with men who had experience in the service. Colonel Bartholomew of the full regiment made application to be permitted to take his regiment in the forenoon of July 4th to a large picnic to be given by colored people in the vicinity of the city, which was granted. Now, I'm going to pause here for just a moment because I want to mention a little bit more about Colonel Bartholomew. He is Orion Alexander Bartholomew, life dates 1837 to 1919, and he was the colonel and commander of the 109th U.S. Colored Infantry. Bartholomew had started the war at first as a sergeant in the 7th Indiana Infantry, and then later became an officer in the 70th Indiana Infantry before jumping to colonel of the 109th. There's a great quote that he wrote in 1915 about the regiment and his colonelcy. He writes, "I was colonel of the finest regiment of colored troops in the Army, and they made a fine appearance and were under perfect discipline." So let me continue with Chetlain's narrative. Colonel Bartholomew of the 1st Regiment, the full regiment, made full application to be permitted to take his regiment in the forenoon of July 4th to a large picnic to be given by colored people in the vicinity of the city, which was granted. As the regiment would have to march through the heart of the city, and the fact became known, a committee of leading citizens called upon me to protest against it, fearing that this display of colored troops in the city might lead to riot and bloodshed. I answered that these were United States troops who had a right to pass through their city. I told the committee that permission had been granted to the regiment and that I hoped their citizens would have the good sense not to interfere with it. I then sent for Colonel Bartholomew and gave him instructions to have each man in the regiment furnished with 10 rounds of ammunition, and if interfered with or attacked by a mob, under no circumstances were the men to fire unless so ordered by an officer. The regiment marched by 4s down the principal street in fine order and presented a splendid appearance. It was as fine a body of men physically as I had ever seen. The men were nearly newly uniformed with new arms, and all wore white cotton gloves. The streets were crowded with people. but all was as quiet as if it had been a funeral procession. After the regiment had passed out of sight, the crowd became boisterous, protesting vehemently at the insult which had been given the people of Louisville. After the picnic, which was attended by 3,000 to 4,000 colored people and was a quiet and well conducted affair, the regiment returned to its quarters by another route. The above incident shows the animus of the people of the loyal state of Kentucky at that time. Soon after the occurrence related above, a committee of leading citizens, mostly from Louisville, went to Washington, D.C., and, getting the members of Congress from the state to join them, went to President Lincoln and laid their grievances before him, representing that the methods now practiced in their state of taking their best hands from their tobacco fields for the army was wrong and would soon ruin every tobacco grower in the state. The result was that the War Department, before the middle of August, revoked the order for recruiting in Central and East Kentucky and ordered me back to Memphis to continue my work in Tennessee and West Kentucky. In less than 2 months, there had been recruited at the Louisville and Owensboro stations over 3 full regiments of infantry composed of a superior class of men. In compliance with the order, I moved my headquarters to Memphis. So there you have the story from Brigadier General Augustus Louis Chetlain, talking about the men that he recruited, over 3,000 troops, U.S. colored infantry regiments in Kentucky, the problems he had in Louisville, and how the citizens went to Washington to complain. Before we end, I do want to show one more image. This is a rare, I'm going to call it a rare engraving because it's hidden more or less in a book the title of this engraving is Our Colored Soldiers, and it comes from an 1866 book by an author named Fraser Kirkland. And the name of the book is The Pictorial Book of Anecdotes and Incidents of the War of the Rebellion. I'll probably take a closer look at this book and maybe pick out a couple of incidents to share with you in a future video. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.